Hello everybody. Welcome to Unit 3 of the second term of Ways of Seeing. If you're wondering what this is, it's a heat pack because I've done my shouldering. So let's get cracking. So far you've thought about how seeing is constructed via John Berger, and then you've been more recently thinking about where we see from, so thinking about positionality and the ways in which we are multiply positioned in and by social discourses. And crucially, you've been thinking about the ways we are positioned. So thinking about positionality less as a set of identity characteristics or categories, rather, that you can sort of pick off a shelf, and thinking more about the ways in which we are located within and by social discourses and by others. In this sense, I think you've been thinking about how positionality isn't volitional, it is structural. Today we're moving forward to think about why we bother to read literature and texts at all. Seriously, what's the point? I'm thinking here of literature and text quite broadly conceived, so this would include filmic text, poetic text, theatre text. So I'm thinking of text in an expanded sense to mean cultural works. We're going to spend some time thinking about not only the ways we analyse text, but why we do that. Seriously, what's the point? What is the work of the literary critic? That's one of the questions that's animating this lecture. And here I want to supplement the questions you've been asking about positionality to again ask where we read from. However, not in the sense of our identity categories or our positionalities within discourse, but rather where we read from in terms of our practices and our experiences of reading. Do we read from the head or the heart, or somewhere indeterminate in between? What is the place of emotion within reading practice? Is literary interpretation an act of the inchoate soul or of the systematic brain? Is literary criticism an art or a science, or neither? Famously, D.H. Lawrence argued, literary criticism can be no more than a reasoned account of the feeling produced upon the critic by the book he is criticising. Criticism can never be a science. It is, in the first place, much too personal, and in the second, it is concerned with values that science ignores. The touchstone is emotion, not reason. We judge a work of art by its effect on our sincere and vital emotion and nothing else. All the critical twiddle-twaddle about style and form, all this pseudo-scientific classifying and analysing of books in an imitation botanical fashion, is mere impertinence and mostly dull jargon. What Lawrence seems to be resisting here is the imposition of a form of scientism on literary criticism that is anathema to the enigmatic and incomplete nature of literary endeavour. However, as Raymond William notes in the article you've read to help prepare for this lecture, how we quantify and account for these notions of sincerity and vitality is a vexed and political question. Williams reminds us that one does not read in a vacuum, historical, social, personal, or otherwise. That is to say, when one reads, one necessarily and unavoidably reads with others. Literature, in this sense, is a form of companionship. It keeps us company, and it reminds us of the company we keep. And Raymond reminds us that in our interpretations, in our provisional but passionate convictions, we may discover the political purpose of our reading. After all, there is no such thing as a factual interpretation of literature. If we are doing it, then we must hope to do something with our interpretations, to do something with the zones of contact between us and the text. Otherwise, seriously, what's the point? Now, of course, there are almost facts. Hamlet, for example, does feature a character called Hamlet. However, this is to tell you nothing of what Hamlet means. Moreover, is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, in which Hamlet himself does not appear, not also always Hamlet? And if so, then indeed there are no factual interpretations. To be clear, this is not to advocate for a sort of tedious pseudo-relativism along the lines of, I can never truly know what yellow is because I can only ever see my version of yellow. No. What I'm saying here is that literary interpretation is an event or an encounter that brings together the materiality of the work, that is, what is on the page, stage, screen, with the materiality of the conditions in which we encounter the work, our social position, historical context, our political convictions. To put it more simply, criticism is a verb. Nor is this a call for a kind of anything goes approach to the task of critical analysis. There must be rigour. However, exactly what rigour means is another vexed question. It may be worth reflecting here on what models of rigour you have inherited, and what forms of rigour am I trying to instantiate here? Ask yourselves, what constitutes rigour in the practice of critical analysis today? Williams' article, tackling as it does structuralism, practical criticism and so on, invites us to consider these ideas of intellectual traditions, habits and norms anew. What was the purpose of reading in the 1970s when Williams is writing this article? And what is it now? Why are you here? What are you hoping to do with your words? What intellectual traditions are you steeped in at the moment? And are you happy to be so steeped? One possible element that may offer a contact zone between the 1970s and the contemporary moment is perhaps around questions of identity politics then and expert by experience now. To offer a lightning introduction of the concept, the notion of identity politics emerged from the Combahee River Collective, a group of black queer women who, amongst other things, explained that until they were free, no one was. Their movement was in response, as at least in part rather, in response to the failures of white middle-class feminism and the dominance of a particular form of masculinity in the civil rights movement. Both, they said, failed to adequately address the oppressions faced by black women. They decided to organise to respond to their particular experiences of minoritisation and oppression. They were also inspired by anti-colonial movements and sought the overthrow of capitalism. Their work sought to find solidarities across different forms of oppression. This wasn't an isolationist move. It was a project that sought to pay particular attention both to a set of experiences based on identity and sought forms of solidarity across other social movements and identities. To put it in super basic terms, their questions were, this is what's been happening to us because of who we are and how we are positioned within capitalism. How does that connect with what's happening to you and the ways that you are being positioned within capitalist discourse? And are there points of connection that we could use as grounds for shared resistance and action? And how can we support you, even when our interests are more distant from yours? In short, what can we do about this to make this world better? This is the origins of identity politics. However, what this has been distorted to in our times is a kind of narrow definition of group interests, often at the exclusion of others. Groups have been pitted against one another and their resistance and activism corporatised. Think of the corporatisation of pride, for example. In short, identity politics has been weaponised as a concept by the right to effect an antagonistic relativism. Identity politics for the Combahee River Collective was a way to analyse the world, to make political decisions, and ultimately to try and change it. As a tool, rather, to try and change it. You might want to pause here, reflect upon these questions. How does identity politics show up in your reality and your experiences? What does solidarity mean today? With whom are you allied, whether or not you wish to be? And how does that come to pass? What power do you have to change that? On what ground can you move politically? And perhaps most crucially, do you? If you're interested in this subject, a really interesting place to start is with Olufemi Taiwo's recent book, Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. In this, Taiwo critiques not only the way the powerful have hijacked identity politics to their own ends, but also how trauma and oppression are not particularly useful as the primary basis of political activism. Okay, so having opened up some basic questions about intellectual and political traditions and where you might sit within them, let us now turn to Jerusalem and questions of cultural materialism. At its most basic, cultural materialism, a term coined by Raymond Williams, is a reading practice that is comprised of four main elements: historical context, theoretical method, political commitment, and textual analysis. Cultural materialists read texts in order to better understand the political and social conditions of their production and reception. They're interested in how hegemonic forces in societies might appropriate, say, Shakespeare or Austen, to further or sustain their dominance. They're also interested in how literature may offer a particular form of access to the consciousness of a given period. What does, for example, the rise of the slasher horror in the 1980s reveal about the political conditions and power relations of the time? What does the repeated appearance of natural landscapes, forests and woods in playwriting at the turn of the 21st century tell us about our social consciousness at that time? What does the rise of a new form, or the revision of an old one, such as tragedy, expose about the social relationships of a given moment? What do cultural works tell us, and what do cultural works do? These and others are some of the motivating questions of cultural materialism. So what I'm going to do now is offer a reading of Jez Butterworth's 2009, not 1999. I'm going to offer a reading of Jez Butterworth's 2009 play, Jerusalem. And as I do, I want you to consider the ways in which I might engage these four tenets of cultural materialism in the practice of interpretation, and what, if any, of this is useful for your own practices of reading and writing about cultural works. It is a lament for England, said Susanna Clapp, while Charles Spencer suggested it was a pagan hymn to a vanishing rural England, and Michael Coveney described it as epic. The it in question is Jez Butterworth's play Jerusalem, first seen at the Royal Court in 2009 before its West End transfer to the Apollo. Matt Wolf's review in the New York Times is even more categorical, declaring it a State of the Nation play, only to add the rather tentative qualifier, I suppose. The critically acclaimed play concerns one day in the life of a rural Wiltshire village, Flintock. It's the 23rd of April, St. George's Day, and of course, Shakespeare's birthday. The action follows protagonist Johnny Rooster Byron, a magical and flawed figure of Romany gypsy descent, whom the critics tumbled over themselves to variously frame as the Lord of Misrule, the Pied Piper, Puck, Falstaff, Prospero. He lives in a caravan in a wood outside the village and is being evicted because of his misdeeds, including attacking a civil servant in the foyer of the Salisbury Arts Centre during the interval of Jack and the Beanstalk, and doing whiz off the bar during the meat raffle, and on Kiddy's Fun Day he slaughtered a pig in the car park. Coincidentally, the local government is building a new estate of houses in his woodland, the land where Rooster Byron implies he has lived for centuries. Quote, "This wood is called Rooster's Wood. I've been here since before all you bent busybody bastards were born. I'm a heavy stone." End quote. The play follows the encroaching intrusion of the police and government into the woods, as well as the glee and chaos that take place therein. Byron is accompanied, as he always has been, as the play reveals, by a gaggle of kids who hang out in a distorted pastoral idyll, buying and taking drugs, getting pissed and shagging, just as they always have and as they always will. Byron notes, "Kids love drinking, always did. Everyone knows what they're up to, all the mums and dads. Why? Because they did the same fucking thing and younger. There's not one mum or dad round here that could come here and say they weren't drinking, smoking, pilling, and the rest when they were that and younger, and shagging too, like cats in a sack. The play, then, does have some hallmarks of a State of the Nation piece, with its concern with the people and politics of local government and law enforcement, its evident concern with England and nationhood, its sizable cast and scale, running at just under 3.5 hours with 2 intervals. However, it is useful to attend to the manners in which the piece engages with the traditional State of the Nation form. I think that it might be more interesting to explore it through the optic of tragedy and climate crisis. This is not to suggest that this is a play about climate crisis. It is not. But it is to suggest that perhaps, in its attention to England, to folklore, heritage and catastrophe, Jerusalem harnesses strategies of tragedy to explore the kind of life and land we are preparing for the next lot. In this way, I would suggest Butterworth seizes on classical traditions to explore political questions. I wonder if he's thereby reshaping what political theatre might mean. From Daniel Kitson's It's Always Right Now Till It's Later, to Linda Brogan and Polly Teal's Speechless, to Lawrence Wilson's Tiny Volcanoes, and of course Butterworth's Jerusalem, the anthemic song Jerusalem is a familiar stage melody. Notable players are also continuing to cast the British nation in theatrical colours. Dennis Kelly's 2009 Orphans, sections of Mark Ravenhill's Shoot, Get, Treasure, Repeat from 2008, David Harrower's 365 from 2008 as well, or Simon Stevens' 2008 Pornography. This is echoed in filmmaking, as evidenced by the work of Shane Meadows, including This Is England, Somers Town, and This Is England 86. Moreover, while by no stretch of the imagination a new stage environment, the countryside is an increasingly present stage site for contemporary theatre. As Eleanor Fuchs has explained, while from the wild hillside where Pentheus was dismembered to Lear's Heath and beyond, non-metropolitan landscapes have long been present on stage, and there's a notable shift at the turn of the 19th century in the role of landscape in performance. She writes, quote, "In the symbolic avalanches of Ibsen, the threatened forests of Chekhov, the ecstatically open or pathologically closed world of Wedekind, the trembling atmospheres of Maeterlinck, and the layerscapes of late Strindberg, one can begin to see landscape itself as an independent figure, not simply a support of human action, but entering it in a variety of roles, for instance, as mentor, obstacle, or ironist. This turn from scenographic representation as platform for human action to a sense of agency on the part of landscape is also evident in contemporary theatre practice. Peter Gill's The York Realist, Martin Crimp's The Country, Nell Lation's Comfort Me With Apples, Richard Bean's Harvest, Jez Butterworth's The Night Heron, Carol Churchill's Far Away, all respond to notions of rural life and environment beyond the sort of limits of spatial dramaturgy. Far Away, for example, is bookended by remote country spaces where the stars are brighter, where there are no streetlights. Yet much more than being a sight, the landscape in this piece is a lens through which to perceive the cataclysmic perversion of nature for capitalist ends. Everything's been recruited. There were piles of bodies, and if you stopped to find out, there was one killed by coffee or one killed by pins. They were killed by heroin, petrol, chainsaws, hairspray, bleach, foxgloves. The smell of smoke was where they were burning the grass that wouldn't serve. The Bolivians are working with gravity, but we're getting further with noise, and there's thousands dead of light in Madagascar. Who's going to mobilise darkness and silence? That's what I wondered in the night." End quote. Jerusalem, like Far Away, dovetails theatrical form with the politics of ecology, in order to allow notions of space and place to be registered beyond simply a visual dynamic on stage. Following Raymond Williams' lead, Butterworth is alive to the dialogic relationship between ecology and economy. In its attention to localism, inheritance, land and folklore In its attention to localism, landscape and land and folklore, The play makes luminous the plural politics of landscape. Byron says, I once met a giant that built Stonehenge just off the A14 outside Upavon, about half a mile from the Little Chef. I've been up 3 days and nights straight playing canasta with these old ladies in a retirement home outside Wootton Bassett. So I set off from Wootton and I ran out of petrol outside Wilcott. So I pushed it through the night all the way from Wilcott to Potterne. End quote. The multiplying references to local sites, the careful scenographic composition, quote, a curtain with the faded cross of St. George, a proscenium adorned with cherubs and woodland scenes, dragons, maidens, devils, half and half creatures, across the beam, in capital letters, the English Stage Company. And Wiltshire folklore that bleeds sideways throughout the dialogue and characterisation leave one without question that this is a place about here, and precisely what here might mean. The recent theatrical turn to the countryside to the city stages has been pursued with energy. It's a trend journalists have dubbed new ruralism or bucolic noir. It's accompanied by a distinct but related development in British theatre, the resurgence of the local. And this can be witnessed in regional theatre programming such as the Liverpool Everyman and Northern Stage, or in Payne's Plough's initiative Come to Where I'm From, where local writers across the country were commissioned to write short monologues about their homes. A burgeoning interest in localism, cultural identity and heritage is palpable. The expanding work in site-responsive, ecological and walking performance practices further testifies to this revivified dialogue between place and performance at the start of the 21st century. Indeed, these developments collectively conspire to evidence a twinned concern with place and politics in British performance practice. It seems possible, then, that geographical spectres of the state of the nation are finding alternative new lives. These modern pieces have abandoned the epic time frames and panoramic settings of the traditional state of the nation form, but they do retain a concern with the mechanics of state power and the root cultural identities that might lie beneath. Perhaps what these plays seek to excavate, particularly in the case of Jerusalem, is an exacting and exclusive focus on what national identity might even mean. Think of the character of Davy, for example, who says, I've never seen the point of other countries. I leave Wiltshire, my ears pop. Seriously, I'm on my bike, pedalling along, see a sign that says Welcome to Berkshire, I turn straight round. I don't like to go east of Wootton Bassett. So the extreme localism of Davy, determined as he is to spend his unimprovable life with the same fucking people, going to the same shit pubs, kill 2 million cows and die a sad fat povo, end quote, is that indicative of a reactionary individualism, of a small town lad, or, in the broader context of the play, is it a sort of strange, thoughtful awareness about one's place in a global environment? ? Does Davy's local isolation... Sorry, the cat's getting in the way. Does Davy's local isolation offer a tiny nod to the insurmountable figure of global disaster and its total disregard and disinterest in geographical borders and demarcations? Does his blinkered outlook signal a form of hunkering down, of battening down the hatches in the face of the looming storm? I don't know. What do you think? I wonder if, in the case of Jerusalem, a preoccupation with geographical minutiae and the natural landscape marks a countermove to the non-spaces and boundaryless homogeneity of global capital and its devastating environmental consequences. How many houses are you building? Who gets the contract? Who gets the kickbacks? You're right, kids come here. Half of them are safer here than they are at home. What the fuck do you think an English forest is for? Byron here rails against the destruction of the land in the name of a storm we call progress, to borrow from Walter Benjamin's phrase. It's vital to note that Jerusalem's retreat to the local woods isn't in the spirit of nationalism or isolationism. It's a portrait of English. As a portrait of English identity, I would suggest it's highly ambivalent. Rather, it offers landscape as a prism through which to ask broader questions of culture, identity, place. Jen Harvey persuasively asserts that, quote, national identities are neither biologically nor territorially given, rather they are creatively produced or staged, end quote. If communities and identities are sustained by acts of remembering, then one does not need to scan Jerusalem far to excavate performances of heritage and Englishness. The Flintock Fair, Wesley's Morris dancing, the gang's anti-council protests, Byron's oral folkloric storytelling. Jerusalem is, in many ways, England, old and new performed. Nevertheless, this does not equate to a performance of nationalism, but it does have a heightened geographical sensibility, and here I think the play troubles the ancient ground upon which here and now might be built. To return to the notion of climate catastrophe, one must readily acknowledge that it is glib to suggest that global warming has no geographical boundaries, given its impact is felt profoundly in particular ways in the global south. One response to this is to consider, is it a matter of time? Another is to ask whether plays like Jerusalem are posing these questions now about how one responds to global crisis, in the possibly vain, hope that the wealthy will do something different. Again, I'm not suggesting that Jerusalem is a messages first climate crisis play, in the manner of something like Steve Waters' The Contingency Plan, or Mike Bartlett's Earthquakes in London, I think probably are. Jerusalem is a play that performs the destruction of our green and pleasant lands in order to ask more broadly, what are we passing on to the next lot? In a letter, in response to the controversy that surrounded the first public performance of Edward Bond's Saved on the 7th of February 1969, Laurence Olivier wrote, "Saved is not for children, but it is for grown-ups, and the grown-ups of this country should have the courage to look at it. And if we do not find precisely the mirror held up to nature in which we can see ourselves, then at least we can experience the sacramental catharsis of a very chastening look at the sort of ground we have prepared for the next lot." My contention is that Butterworth, working in a different aesthetic and from different motivations, asks the same question: what sort of ground have we prepared for the next lot? And I can't really think of a more urgent question. In its concern with myth, folklore, heritage and land, Jerusalem is precisely turning this question onto the vast and imprecise notion of global uncertainty and of environmental disaster. The Apollo theatre programme furthers this abiding sense that Butterworth's play is casting backwards for a sense of English selfhood that will in some way perhaps offer some kind of permanence against the volatility of now. Paul Kingsnorth, an environmental activist and author whose works include Real England from 2009, wrote a piece entitled Oak, Ash and Thorn for the programme, which explores the forgotten folklore of England and wonders if, quote, when climate change comes to England, it will banish the oak and the ash and the thorn. It's noticeable, then, that the reviewer's frequent descriptions of Rooster Byron as a postmodern Puck find resonance in the programme's environmental note. In Rudyard Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill, the ancient eponymous figure says that, quote, he came to England with oak, ash and thorn, and when oak, ash and thorn are gone, I shall go too. End quote. Byron's identity is inextricably nested into the play's dense intimations of natural landscape. At the close of the play, as Rooster calls up Cornish giants, Norse gods, pagan May-Day characters, and Brutus of Albion to assist his fight for the land, he also calls up Yggdrasil, an immense ash tree from Norse mythology. By tracing the logic of the mythical and poetic allusions here, one can discern a clear sense that the attack on Rooster Byron is an attack on the land. For the destruction of Rooster, read the destruction of nature and indeed history. Quote, I've seen a lot of strange things in this wood. I've seen a plague of frogs, of bees, of bats. I've seen a rainbow hit the earth and set fire to the ground. I've seen the air go still and all sound stop, and a golden stag in the clearing. 14-point antlers of solid gold. I've heard an oak tree cry. I've heard beech singing hymns. I've seen a man they buried in a churchyard Friday sitting under a beech eating an apple on Saturday. When the light goes and I stare out into the trees, there's always a pair of eyes out there in the dark, watching. End quote. Rooster Byron, ancient green man, is not so much in the wood as of it. It seems fair then to suggest that Jerusalem is in many ways a modern contortion of a State of the Nation drama, whose object is to stage an aesthetic encounter with contemporary crises of nation, of heritage, of land. Eco-critics such as Una Chowdhury have described environmental catastrophe as a crisis of values. But I wonder what the purposeful political reading of this somewhat traditional play participates in. Am I participating in the problem that Dan Rebellato identifies within academic discourse, that the model of political theatre and the story of its decline continues to dominate critical and academic responses to playwriting? Moreover, one wonders if it simply bears the imprint of another critical paradigm, eco-criticism. While the play bears the weight of this critical framework, well, how well? Will this endure, and does it matter? If Beckett's Endgame and Ionescu's The Chairs can now be read as ecological plays, what will become of Jerusalem? Will it be a prophetic analogy for a future that is as yet unfathomable? It's not unreasonable then to wonder what is at stake in the excavation. It's valuable to wonder what is at stake in the evacuation of value from a term like political theatre. If all academic discourse is necessarily a historically produced language with a shelf life that attempts to make philosophical, intellectual and emotional sense of shared knowledge and experience, then what is at stake in the dismantling of such vocabulary? Theory and practice must, of course, keep pace with their environment, but what happens to a play like Jerusalem that is in some ways out of date? Is it stuck in a space of irrelevance, tethered to old models of State of the Nation or political theatre? Acknowledging the trajectory of a politicised playwriting practice in Britain and locating Jerusalem's position within this history allows one to discern what writers like Butterworth are inheriting and what they are seeking to transform. But rather than simply pointing to a development in the well-worn area of political theatre, what I'm trying to suggest is that you can be something of a critical magpie, collecting ideas and principles from plural sources and circumventing the rigidity and straitjacketing of certain types of reading practice. So while interrogating Jerusalem's standing, is it a State of the Nation play, for example, I wonder if we can set that aside and instead ask how far tragedy, for example, offers an optic through which to perceive the work. And in particular, what happens if you put tragedy and climate change in dialogue? And I wonder what that tells you about theatre's capacity and its limits in engaging with our current ecological crisis. Steve Waters has commented that global warming and climate change may be the closest thing humans have come to tragedy on a scale depicted in classical form in centuries. This prompted me to wonder how far ideas of environmental disaster conform to a dramatic model and what the implications of this could be for 21st century performance. The precise nature of tragedy and its politics, its contemporary relevance and manifestations have been vigorously debated. If tragedy, as Adrian Poole notes, stages moments of crisis in a community's understanding of itself, if it features exceptional figures who are flawed and commit unwitting acts of transgression or folly, if it stages unprecedented suffering, if it delves into questions of blame and justice, if it hinges on a mechanic of the alterable and the inevitable, then one can begin to see some connections between this ancient form and our contemporary grim reality. Climate change is of our making, yet not our fault. Not wholly our fault, not solely our fault. While our collective behaviour has brought about the problem, the corrosive and fatal actions were, for a long time perhaps, committed in degrees of ignorance and powerlessness. Moreover, the exceptional figure in this global drama is in many ways almost godlike, insofar as it is all of humankind itself, and, of course, the 1%, the most powerful. The fall of this hero is great, the suffering immeasurable. The tragedy, many would argue, is now inevitable. Furthermore, it has initiated a flurry of reparative action, altered behaviours, in order to lessen or at least hasten our now sealed fate. The global community's understanding of itself is indeed in crisis. Raymond Williams wrote, quote, "Before, we could not recognise tragedy as social crisis. Now, commonly, we cannot recognise social crisis as tragedy." Terry Eagleton develops these ideas and attempts to replenish the relevance of the form, in spite of its denigration from both the political left and the political right. In Sweet Violence, the idea of the tragic, he urges the critical community to reconsider the form, and not least those aspects of tragedy which seem most alien, most obsolete, for he suggests they're surprisingly close to contemporary radical concerns. Like Eagleton, I'm interested in pausing briefly over ancient ideas of heroes, inevitability, and fate, in order to illuminate what might be at stake in these old ideas and their presence in new stages. Presence on new stages. Far from being an interpretive leap, I think Butterworth deliberately scatters classical and Elizabethan associations throughout his writing in order to activate a tragic gaze. Not only does the play take place on Shakespeare's birthday, but also the lead is played and indeed was written for one of the best Shakespearean actors of his generation, Mark Rylance. A young girl named Phaedra has gone missing. She's the reigning May Queen, and Rooster Byron, the king of the forest, is suspected wrongly, the play implies, of raping her. The play is taking place in an Arden-like forest on a set that uses real trees, live chickens, fish, and actor Mackenzie Crook's herd of tortoises. Notably, the trees were rotten, so already earmarked for felling, and thus they got a new lease of life through the production, an important detail in a play that has landscape as at its theatrical heart. There's the rabble of young people who attend Byron's ramshackle court, who in their roles as plasterers, decorators and abattoir workers, in their gleeful humour, recall Bottom and his mechanicals, quote, "Flintock Fair's got a meditation cave. You go in, and Pat Cannon is sat there alone on a folding chair smoking Lambert and Butler. I'm sorry, but not fucking likely am I going to pay 10 quid to lie in the dark and let Phil Cannon's mum get a cheapie. I've gone, where's the massager, Pat? I've fucking trained 6 months, you cheeky cunt. And anyway, it's a masseuse." So I said, "What's wrong with your shoes?" The play is stuffed with literary and specifically Shakespearean allusions. However, it is with Rooster Byron that one can witness the fusion of tragedy and folklore to startling political effect. Rooster Byron is extraordinary, a remarkable tragic hero. The writing, and indeed the performance, skillfully navigate a precarious fault line in the characterisation between impotent monster and magnificent enigma. On the one hand, he is categorically a sad bastard, who lives alone in a caravan, getting pissed, dealing drugs. And even here, though, I would say that there is a tragic figure nested within that portrait. Quote, "Lying out on the path, you pissed yourself and they pissed on you too, on your face, in your hair, in your mouth. They took photos with their phones and they sent it to everyone." End quote. On the other hand, he is a prophetic ancient with magical blood, quote, rare blood, the rarest there is. Remember the blood, the blood. Rooster Byron, then, is a Byronic hero. He is a portrait of flawed grandeur, sexually charismatic, countercultural, supernatural, monstrous, with pagan if not satanic associations. Indeed, Troy calls him a fucking snake, and he's implicitly the dragon in the professor's tale. Quote, and by this city was a stagnant pond wherein dwelled a dragon which envenomed all the country. And when he came nigh the city, he scorched the people with his breath. End quote. It's also interesting to note in a play alive to classical and early modern theatre that the tragic hero is called Byron. The Greek love affair with Lord Byron is well documented, with even an area of Athens named after the poet, and a minute's silence in the government assembly to commemorate his death. If Byron was an icon of the birthplace of tragedy, it seems apt that Jerusalem performs this tragic lineage through the play's central voice. Rooster Byron is simultaneously a pikey, this is a quote, is simultaneously, quote, a pikey, Stig of the Dump, the lowest piece of shit in the forest, and an immortal legend who, quote, deserves a statue. Jerusalem, in this sense, perhaps answers the challenge of the heroic ideal in contemporary tragedy. As Poole asks, are heroes a, quote, liability, an anachronism, even an embarrassment, end quote. Rooster Byron commands admiration. He is spectacular, and yet is spliced with a credible strain of the everyday. He watches the Antiques Roadshow, drinks vodka Red Bull, and gets caught down the pub in his birthday suit, waving his crown jewels about. Another of his fathom have we plenty. Yet as the action unfolds and Byron's tales... Excuse me, Bruce, cat's back. Yet as the action unfolds and Byron's tales fleck the stage space with magical light, the ordinary man is in a vector of retreat in the language and dramaturgy. The captivating hero instead begins to cast a looming stage shadow that ultimately eclipses the brittle banality of the ordinary, if charismatic, man one encounters at the beginning of Act 1. Indeed, towards the close of Act 2, to reassure his estranged lover Dawn that he would survive the imminent police attack, he shows her, like a blind seer from Greek tragedy, the future. Fate is a light in Byron's eyes. By ushering in the register of predestination and inevitability, Jerusalem further invites a tragic gaze on the stage action. At the play's close, after Byron has been beaten and branded by Phaedra's stepfather, he sets fire to his home and recites a famous gypsy curse on Kennet and Avon Council. May they wander the land forever, never sleep twice in the same bed, never drink water from the same well, and cross the same river twice in a year, and may the heat dry up their souls. Any uniform which brushes a single leaf in the wood is cursed, and he who wears it this St. George's Day, may he not see the next. The apocalyptic curse is followed by a mesmerising incantation calling up kin, gods and giants to his aid. The printed text offers only an enigmatic ellipsis as the final direction. Quote, relentlessly he beats the drum, faster, faster, staring out. He pounds on and on until the final blow rings out and ... The original production answered this aporia with an unambiguous booming footfall. The giants were coming. The tragedy has begun. Byron is a hero. All his earlier elaborate tales of meeting giants near Little Chefs, having special Byron blood and being born on the tip of a speeding bullet, retroactively attain the status of mythic legend. Even the more deliberately absurd stories, such as being kidnapped by traffic wardens, come to have a distinct air of possibility about them. He is Rooster Byron, after all. He is folkloric Green Man, a pagan relic associated with vulgarity and drunkenness, spliced with tragic exceptionality, an ordinary legend whose fall presages our own. Jerusalem is then a play that is a modern tragedy. It traverses the form without adhering itself wholly to its formula and conventions. Butterworth offers a challenge to genre classifications which I think is appropriate to his subject. The enormous scale of the piece acknowledges the enormity of the interlocking ideas therein: history, heritage, memory, environment. If tragedy, political theatre and landscape are at root simply ways of seeing, then it's vital to ask what is at stake in these lenses. I think it's in its overlapping frames of tragedy, politics and place that Jerusalem can prompt some questions of ecology. At its core, it confronts us with a simple question that is urgent. What sort of land and life are we preparing for the next lot? How do we live for others? The play seems to be ghosted by ancient questions and ancient forms. And here Butterworth, like Terry Eagleton, revives some what might be considered old-fashioned theatrical machinery in order to ask contemporary questions. In so doing, Butterworth gives caution to the idea that tragedy is dead and buried, but rather it, like Byron's giants, might just rise again. Okay, so I think that's probably a good place to stop for you to consider things in your seminars. I want to close with some questions for you to think about, and they are: as you were listening, in what ways did I engage with practices of cultural materialism? In what ways is cultural materialism a way of seeing? What did the reading miss? What did it fail to see? How does positionality interact with cultural materialism? Was Jerusalem the same play when it was revived in 2022, I think, as it was in 2009? And if it wasn't the same play, how do we account for its change? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how does cultural materialism help us get past the habit of evaluating if something is a good or bad representation of a given subject? What does cultural materialism enable us to do to push beyond this kind of evaluative dead end? So I'll leave you with those questions to explore in the seminars. That's all, folks. Bye.